So we're on chapter 23 of your U.S. history book, section 2 now. We're going to go over the Warren G. Harding administration. He was president, 29th president, elected in 1920. It says he was plagued by self-doubt. He was also involved in high tariffs. And during his administration, there were quite a few scandals in his administration, especially the Teapot Dome scandal. So we'll go over that in a bit. So this section, we're going to go over the election of Harding, his foreign affairs and domestic affairs, new immigrants coming in during this time, and on to the Teapot Dome scandal. So we're going to begin right here. One thing about Harding, this picture here says he ran under the campaign slogan of return to normalcy because he was the first president after World War I. And he wanted everything to go back to being normal. So let's begin. Excuse me. The election of Warren G. Harding in 1920. So he was a Republican, lived 1865 to 1923 of Ohio. And he also, under his cabinet, he brought in a lot of his friends from Ohio. They call them the Ohio Gang. And that gang that came in actually was involved in a lot of the scandals that went on during that time that had to do with money, the money scandals. So, but anyway, at the election, it was Warren Harding from Ohio. He had the vice president that ran, and we need to know his name because he will actually become the next president, is Calvin Coolidge. He lived 1822 to 1933. And so Harding and Coolidge ran against James Cox, also of Ohio, was a Democrat. And his vice president that he ran with was a young Franklin D. Roosevelt of New York, who was Assistant Secretary of the Navy. It's very important because later on, Franklin D. Roosevelt would become one of the presidents of the United States during the Depression later on. But at this time, he was running for vice president. So Harding's appeal, again, was America needs normalcy. Let's go back to normalcy after the war. That was Harding. And Harding won the election. Here's a picture of Harding running against James Cox. And of course, Harding winning the election. So let's go on. Foreign affairs. During this time of Harding administration, Japan was taking advantage of China. So Japan had been victors of the war at that time. Japan fought with the Ally side and was very reluctant to have its armaments limited. After the war, as for the military, they made agreements to limit armaments and not produce more as producing for war. So the naval rivalry were the United States, Great Britain, and Japan that had the greatest navies. And back then they were to reduce their ships because their ships and rivaling getting more and more ships instead to stop producing these big warships. So, but Japan, of course, didn't want to do that. But Japan also had taken advantage to expand its influence into the Far East, especially into China. In 1914, Japan seized the Shandong Peninsula in China and the German islands in that area. So Japan was out seizing areas that did not belong to them at that time. In fact, Japan had the famous 21 demands on China. And those 21 demands, here's a picture of the 21 demands as the emperor had on China. Japan wanted to control many of China's factories, railroads, and ports. And if China did not agree, Japan would invade them. And so in the midst of all this going on, there's a rivalry right there and the problem existing between Japan and China. So the 21 demands, just remember that, were the demands Japan had on China. Well, in America, we protested, actually, our government protested what was going on in Japan and its extreme policy and its political demands on China. We had, at that time, quite a few Americans in China. And so Japan threatened to close the open door policy, to close it not only with Japan, or to close that policy in China too. So, and they met at the Paris Peace Conference, and Japan was allowed to keep the German islands, but not into the 21 demands. So you can just see the animosity that was going on between the United States and Japan. And you'll see that on because what happens in World War II, of course, Japan attacks us in World War II. So this is just kind of right now, Japan is not happy with the United States and is more of an isolationist country. Washington Conference on Limitations of Armaments. Think of limitations of armaments as after World War I, and the nations of the world want to limit the country's military armaments for war. And so President Harding called a conference to ease the tension in the Far East with Japan and China, but also to limit armaments. In November to February of 1921 to 1922, they met here in Washington. And the delegates at that time, the countries that came, were Great Britain, France, Italy, Belgium, Netherlands, Portugal, China, and Japan. The Secretary of State was there, not necessarily President Harding being in charge. Now the Secretary of State was given the charge, and his name was Charles Evan Hughes. Hughes upholds diplomacy. So here's Hughes. And he proposed the leading nations to limit the future Navy buildup. So he said they need to scrap some of their ships or get rid of some of their ships. So he said that not only United States, but also the other countries, especially Great Britain and Japan. And so he put forward, and he outlawed the use of poisonous gases in warfare. In World War I, they used poison gases, and now everyone had to wear gas masks. And so he outlawed that use worldwide of poisonous gas warfare. He also put together with submarines. Of course, the Germans had the submarines that were sinking many ships, and they didn't follow the same rules as the ships. So basically, submarines would have rules to follow in the midst of wartime too. So, and Japan did reluctantly give up Shandong Peninsula. And so you can see, even though these conferences are limiting armaments, will they really limit armaments? What do you think? So they drafted at this Washington conference a three-part treaty. And it had called basically different powers. When you talk about the 5 power, the 4 power, and the 9 power. When you say 5 power, that means 5 countries. 5 powerful countries, 4 powerful countries, and 9 powerful countries involved. And so what the first part of this treaty said that these 5 powers, which include Great Britain, the United States, Japan, France, and Italy, that they would have to stop building battleships for 10 years. No more building battleships. Then they also said they needed to reduce their fleets to the ratio of the United States having 15 battleships, British having 15, no more, Japan only having 9, France having 5, and Italy having 5. And that's all the battleships they could have, and not produce any for 10 years. So the 5-power treaty was to do with limiting our battleships. The 4-power treaty had 4 countries: Great Britain, United States, France, and Japan. You notice that Italy's not involved. And basically the 4-part treaty just said that these countries needed to respect the rights of the islands in the Pacific, of the Pacific Islands. They needed to respect their rights. So they had to do with the islands in the Pacific. The 9-power treaty had all 9 nations represented there, and all 9 nations, they agreed to respect China's independence and territorial integrity and maintain an open door policy towards China. So basically the first part of the treaty had to do with the battleships. The next part had to do with the rights of the Pacific Islands. And the 9-power, everyone had to agree to respect China's independence at that time. needless to say, China was not a communist nation yet. So, and there was a lot of things going, especially with Japan. So basically it had three parts of the treaty: 5 power, 4 power, and 9 power, just representing the number of nations that were involved in that part of the treaty. So again here, the 9 power treaty reaffirmed the open door in China. The 4 power treaty had to do with the Pacific Islands. So especially, Japan being involved in both of these areas. So when you look at this treaty, it really was pointing out Japan's what Japan was doing, because in the rest of these countries were not really so much involved with China or the islands, but Japan was. So also an international court, a world court, where they would be able to go and try criminals or such in a court for the whole world. So they took the Covenant of the League of Nations. Now you remember the League of Nations. The United States did not join the League of Nations or believe in the League of Nations at this time. So the League of Nations had a very weak force, really. And in 1920, they decided to put this League of Nations, not just in the League of Nations, but in a court. But they wanted this international court called the World Court. They said that they wanted a permanent court to be where? That met in The Hague, right here, Hague in the Netherlands, okay? So remember we talked about Hague before, and it's actually where we had peace treaties signed. It was supposed to be the peace place, where the world would meet for peace. And so they would have meet with the World Court there. And so the United States cooperated with the World Court, but we never did join the World Court. In fact, we sent delegates there that were official and non-official, but we still did not join the World Court, which seems kind of funny because we were helping in it, yet not joining. Our Congress they fought over the subject of the League of Nations in a World Court. And so, but the World Court was dissolved in 1946. The domestic affairs of the Harding administration now. Domestic means what was happening at home. That was the foreign affairs of the Harding. Now we're going to go into the domestic affairs that were going on. So there was the demobilization of the merchant marine. So we had a multitude of unneeded ships now because we're not at war. So some of the old ships were sold to private companies at very reduced prices, and some were allowed to operate at a loss, and others were scrapped, actually. So that's what happened with the merchant marine. But on to the tariffs, too. Tariffs, during the war, we had an Emergency Tariff Act that was to raise rates to protect industry and agriculture, and the importance of agriculture. So they thought a high tariff would be good. So they put forth this high tariff, 1922, called the Fordney-McCumber Tariff. And it increased the tariffs to 27 to 38.5%. That's a big jump. Now, going back, remember what a tariff is. A tariff is actually the taxes the money they'd have to pay, taxes they have to pay to our federal government when the merchant ships would come in to the ports and bring in supplies from other countries for us to buy. So as these were coming in, tariffs were set upon these prices of what they were charging just to bring their supplies to sell their things in America, right? So the Tariff Commission would prevent a lot of countries from bringing in supplies because they could buy things in America much cheaper, right? So the Tariff Commission then was set up in 1916 to make sure that the tariffs were enforced. So the tariffs would be enforced as these countries merchants were bringing in things from other countries. And so the president could raise or lower the tariffs by 50%. So during the Ford-McCumber, they said, okay, the president, if you decide you want to lower it by 50%, you can lower it. If you want to raise it, you can raise it by 50%. Well, this tariff was very high, but it basically did not have the desired effects. And it actually hindered the economy. Why? Because the countries at that time, could not afford to pay the tariffs. And so, in raising those tariffs, these countries, they owed the United States money. So they could not make money. They were torn apart and in debt to America. So they couldn't pay their debts because they couldn't even make money by selling their products in America. So it backfired on America in the long run. So here we go. Harding's financial blunders. European allies owned $10 billion after World War I and must be able to export products for profit to repay their debt. But the Ford-McCumber tariff raised taxes on these imports, these tariffs, and hurt European business because Americans weren't buying their products. But this made it virtually impossible for them to even repay their debts, as I said before. So the law that raised tariffs is, remember, the Ford-McCumber tariff. So raised the tariffs and that to, I think, all-time high. The Bureau of the Budget. Well, this has to do with the United States keeping a budget, right? Budgeting their federal money, right? So they set the Bureau of the Budget in 1921. And so Congress passed the Budget and Accounting Act to have basically unified yearly budget for the federal government. So every year, annually, they would put forth a new budget and say what they were going to account the money that they brought in for the federal government through tariffs, mainly at this time, and later on through taxes, especially income tax. And so the Bureau of the Budget formed with what's the Treasury Department. So you think of Treasury and Bureau of the Budget. To receive the request, they would receive the request from all the departments under the president's charge and what would be their budget for the year. How much the departments would need to spend. Their spending and what ideas they had in spending the money for. So they would propose an annual budget and estimate and put in the estimates and the expenditures and everything they needed. And then the president and Congress later on could amend this proposed budget and if they wanted to and change it. So at least they had an idea. So the General Accounting Office went to audit the federal accounts then to make sure that they were spending the money they said on the exact things they spent. So in this way, it could help at that time to prevent, an excess of spending, So it was good for the United States to put forth the Bureau of the Budget, don't you think? And on to the Veterans Affairs, the Veterans Bureau. So in 1921, Congress decided to create a Veterans Bureau for those soldiers that were coming back from war times. They were all considered veterans, right? And they would use this, the Congress putting forth this money especially to build hospitals, to make sure that they had hospitals for soldiers that were coming back that had been wounded in war times or that had problems, even psychological problems from war times. And so this would provide vocational rehabilitation programs to help disabled veterans of war. If a soldier had been disabled in war, he should be able to get the help from the Veterans Bureau. And so the American Legion at this time, which was founded in Paris, it was founded on patriotism, conservatism, anti-communism, all these things. But they were the first one to labor for this veterans benefits to make sure that the veterans were going to be compensated as they had been paid very low pay as soldiers. So coming back to make sure that they were compensated, their families were compensated. Many of them could not have lived on the pay that they made as a soldier, right? And so the Veterans Bonus Bill was put forth in 1922. It was actually vetoed by the president, and later on, in 1924, it was vetoed, but the Congress overruled it. So the Veterans Bonus Bill came to help each veteran would have paid up an insurance policy. And this insurance policy would mature in 20 years. And then they could borrow money on the policy. And borrowing money in the policy would get them through the hard times. So that's how they would go about the Veterans Bonus Bill, is through this insurance policy for veterans of war. New immigration laws. Okay, so during the war, immigration dropped off. There was not too many immigrants coming in during the war. But then right after, there was a lot of immigrants coming from different areas of the world. And so the United States had to then adopt an Emergency Quota Act to say only a certain amount of immigrants could come in. And so, in fact, in 1910, they put forth the census quota restricting immigration from each country to 3% of the total immigration. And they used the 1910 census at this time. So now they wanted to change that because they're saying 3% at the 1910. That means how many immigrants came in of those countries? Only 3%. So they went by each country. And so then the United States adopted the Immigration Act of 1924. See, that was 1910. So this was already set. In 1924, they used the census quota not of 1910, but of 1890. That was really tricky because most of the immigrants actually in 1890 came from the Northern and Western Europe. So most of the immigrants came from like Great Britain, France, Norway, those. And so because of that, it gave them an advantage by using that census, saying how many people of that nationality or that country lived there could come in. And so it would limit other countries. So really, it was kind of a respecter of persons. So they actually banned Asians at this time, and this added to more turmoil with Japan, saying you're banning Japanese from coming in during this time. So this was a really, a bad idea of immigration to ban certain cultures and peoples from coming. So, but in 1920, that was 1924, the act. But in 1920, they decided to limit from all parts of the world to only 150,000 per year. 150,000 people per year. So you can see how it went. It went back and forth on immigration. But when you look at that, it was very much limited. So the Emergency Quota Act passed in 1920 was 3% of 1910 immigrant population at that time. They went by 1910. They changed it to 1890, and then they changed it again. So, and then decided to go just limit for 150,000 people. So just to know that this was this was changed quite a bit. So, but here you can see foreign-born population in here, and you can see there was a lot of immigrants from Germany, Italy, Russia, Poland, Great Britain, Canada, Ireland, and Sweden, Austria, Mexico, and then as you went down to Hungary, Norway, Denmark, all the way down, as in Asia, and Romania, very small amounts at that time in the population. Harding's appointments in the Ohio gang. So this is what I was talking about. The Harding administration, when I think of Harding, I don't think he was a very good president. For one thing, he had really control of his cabinet, and he had brought in some of his friends from Ohio that ended up, doing dishonest things and actually putting forth different scams, in the midst of this. And this is what we're going to find out more about. But the Harding, in 1920, running for president, he admitted his lack of leadership qualities, but he said he would surround himself by the best minds of the Republican Party. And so his appointments at that time, he appointed Charles Evan Hughes, the Secretary of State. We already went over him, and he's the one that went through the treaty with the limitation of powers, remember? So that was Hughes, the Secretary of State. Andrew Mellon was the Secretary of Treasury. And we kind of went over the Treasury and balancing the budget and everything. And Andrew Mellon was a businessman, a multimillionaire, in fact. These two guys didn't have much to do with the scandals. Neither did Herbert Hoover. Hoover was the former director of the Food Administration in the war, and everyone really liked Herbert Hoover. And so he became part of the appointments, too, of the cabinet at that time. So these guys really weren't involved in the scams that were going on. But Harding's Ohio friends that he brought in, they brought in corruption and these scams. I say scams, they're scandals. And they pretty much embarrassed Harding. In fact, a lot of people thought that President Harding was involved in him being his friend. So he had to go through a lot of stress. In fact, some people say the reason he possibly had a heart attack or whatever because of the anxiety of everyone thinking that he was involved and this whole thing going on right in his midst as he was president. So his friends, Harry Micaiah Daugherty, and he was the Attorney General, and Albert Bacon Fall. These two, one 1860 to 1941 and 1861 to 1945, was the Secretary of Interior. So the Attorney General and Secretary of Interior are high places in the government. Here's a picture of them all right here. Are high places in the government, and they both were involved, and especially in the Teapot Dome scandal. So, and they were tried as guilty and ended up going to prison. So, especially when we talk Albert Bacon Fall, the Secretary of the Interior. So let's talk a little bit about this Teapot Dome scandal. So it was the biggest scandal of this time. And the Secretary of the Interior, Fall was his name, he violated the United States law. Instead, he went on into Teapot Dome, Wyoming. That's the name, the reason it's called Teapot Dome. Here's a picture of, looks like a teapot dome exploding on the White House. But Teapot Dome, Wyoming is where the oil reserves were, and also in Elk Hills, California. And so he basically was a scandal through taking these oil reserves and receiving cash and bonds up to $300,000. So he was embezzling in the midst of all this. And later he was imprisoned and fined for what had happened. And other scandals were also coming to light in 1923 of June. And so Harding, in the midst, was asked to speak on a tour to the western states and onto Alaska. And so here we have a picture. Everyone's running the White House highway oil scandal and everything. But he was on tour, and then him having to go through and be possibly indicted on these scandals was a big deal as a president, right? It turned out that he was not closely involved in the scandals, but on return from Alaska to California in his tour, he became quite ill. In fact, he died in San Francisco on August 2nd of 1923, before the election of 1924. So here he is in the midst of his presidency, only being in president for 3 years, and he had a heart attack and died. Some people even say, well, that the stress of the scandals may have produced this. There were other things he was involved in too, some marital affairs and some other things that were going on. And in the midst of all this, he had a heart. They think it was his heart, even though they didn't do an autopsy and they weren't really sure what happened. So they think, well, maybe his wife poisoned him and all this. Well, no. But anyway, he died in the midst. And so, of course, then the vice president would become the president. So it was a shocker to the vice president. And the vice president at that time was Calvin Coolidge. So we'll get into that. So let's talk a little bit more about Warren G. Harding, about his life. A little bit there. We went over some of these things. He served just 3 years, 1921 to 1923. Here's some pictures of he and his wife down here. He was an Ohio native and a Republican. He was also had been a successful newspaper publisher and also served in the Ohio legislature and the U.S. Senate. So he was involved in politics before that. And then in 1920, he won the general election in a landslide when he said he was going to return to normalcy. This is after World War. We went over that already. He came from an American farming family. In fact, his dad was a farmer and later a doctor, and his mother was a midwife at that time. So he was a very popular American, and he was pretty easygoing, so they liked his personality. So he was generally a conciliator. That means he basically stood back and just kind of make sure things were going status quo. And so he never took any strong stands on any issues at all. The other government officials took payoffs. When we talked about that, his Ohio gang and embezzled funds, and this caused him great anxiety, probably producing his death. But anyway, he also had allegedly had some extramarital affairs, and the really weird thing is the 18th Amendment comes through, and the 18th Amendment here is prohibition, that they decided that alcohol would be illegal. And so even when they put forth the 18th Amendment, Harding and his wife, President Warren Harding and his wife in the White House still served alcohol, despite the 18th Amendment. So here he was breaking the same laws that were being brought by Congress. You can imagine that. So he was going to drink anyway, right? And he also had some moral issues in his life. So he's wasn't the finest of presidents. In fact, some people think that Harding was one of the worst presidents. So anyway, he was the first president to visit Alaska. Okay, let's stop there.